good evening and welcome. Settle in wherever you are and let the day loosen its grip on you, one finger at a time. Tonight, let me tell you a story. The whole long story of a poor boy born in a one-room cabin on the American frontier, in a place so remote and so plain that no one who saw him then could ever have dreamed what he would become. He would grow up with almost nothing. No wealth, no schooling to speak of, no name that anyone knew. And yet he would rise, slowly and against every odd, to hold a breaking nation together in its darkest hour. It is a long story, and I mean to tell it slowly, the way stories are best told at the close of a day. There is no hurry now. You have nowhere to be but here. This story does not begin where you might expect. It does not open in a great marble hall, beneath a vast seated statue gazing out over a still reflecting pool. It does not begin with a tall stone monument, or a face carved into a mountainside, or a solemn portrait hung in a place of honor. Those things come much later, long after the man himself was gone. Set them aside for now. Let the grand pictures dissolve into the dark, and let your mind drift somewhere smaller, rougher, and far more ordinary than any of them. It begins instead in the deep woods of Kentucky, on a cold Sunday morning in the winter of 1809. Snow lay on the bare trees, and a hard wind moved through the forest. In a small cabin of rough-hewn logs, with a dirt floor and a single shuttered window, a child was born to a poor and wandering farmer and his quiet, thoughtful wife. There was no doctor, no fine linen, no celebration in any town. There was only the crackle of a wood fire, the cold pressing at the walls, and a new life come into the world in the middle of a great wilderness. They named him Abraham after a grandfather he would never know. He came into a world that offered him nothing but hard work and hard weather. His people were the poorest sort of frontier folk, moving on whenever the soil failed or the rent came due, chasing a better patch of ground that always seemed to lie a little further west. No one wrote down the hour of his birth. No bells rang. And yet from that dirt-floored cabin, by a road none could have charted, this child would travel further than any king. The road ahead of him was long, and it was not gentle. He would lose his mother while still a boy, and dig a grave with his own small hands. He would grow tall and strong swinging an axe in the endless forest, splitting rails from morning until night. He would teach himself, by firelight, nearly everything he ever knew, reading the same few precious books until he had them almost by heart. And step by patient step, this unschooled woodsman would make himself into a lawyer, and then into a leader, and then into something the young country badly needed and did not yet know it had. For the nation he was born into was young and restless, and carrying within it a deep and terrible flaw. It called itself the land of the free, and yet millions within its borders were held in bondage, bought and sold like cattle. That contradiction ran through the country like a crack through stone, widening year by year, until at last it threatened to break the whole thing apart. and it would fall to this tall, sorrowful, kindly man to stand in the gap when the breaking came, and to ask whether a nation so divided could survive at all. But do not worry over any of that tonight. There will be no test in the morning. You need not hold the names or keep the dates in their proper order, or remember which battle came before which. That is my work, and not yours. Your only task is to rest. Let the story wash over you like a slow tide, in and out, carrying a little more of your wakefulness away with each turn. If your eyes grow heavy, and the words begin to blur softly together, that is exactly as it should be. Let them carry you down gently toward sleep. If you find that these quiet histories bring you rest night after night, you might think of subscribing to Lamplight History, but only if it truly helps you sleep. There is no need and no hurry at all. I would far rather you drift off before the end than stay awake to press a single button. The stories will keep. They will be here tomorrow night, and the night after that, waiting patiently for you whenever you need a soft voice in the dark. And if some small part of you is still awake and still curious, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight and what hour it is where you lie. A great city at midnight, a farmhouse before the dawn, a quiet room somewhere with rain against the glass. Leave a word in the comments, if you like, and tell me. It is a strange and lovely thing to think of so many people in so many far-apart places, all drifting down toward the same sleep to the same old story. Now, let us begin where the story truly starts, not with greatness, but with the wild land itself, long before this child was ever thought of. Close your eyes for a moment and picture the American frontier as it was 200 years ago and more. A vast, dark, unbroken forest, rolling westward mile upon mile beyond the edge of the settled world. Here there were no cities, no paved roads, no lamps burning in orderly streets. There was only the forest and the rivers and the smoke of a few scattered cabins rising thin against an enormous sky. It was a hard and lonely country, and beautiful in its hardness. Great trees stood close together, so old and so tall that beneath them the light fell green and dim even at noon. Wolves called across the ridges at night. Deer moved like shadows through the trees. The people who lived here lived far apart, a day's walk or more from their nearest neighbor, and they learned to depend on their own two hands for very nearly everything: their food, their shelter, their fire, their very survival through the long cold winters. Into this world came the family of Thomas Lincoln, the father of our story, a strong, honest, wandering man who could barely write his own name. He was a carpenter and a farmer, good with his hands and poor in his pocket, always hoping the next farm would be the one that finally prospered. He had married a woman named Nancy, gentle and grave and wiser than her station, who could read a little and who carried within her a quiet longing for something more than the mud and the labor of the frontier. They were plain people, the Lincolns, and there was no shame in it, for nearly everyone on the frontier was plain. Their whole lives were bounded by the seasons and the soil, when to clear the trees, when to plant the corn, when to slaughter the hog before the frost. They owned little and expected little. They had known hardship as a constant companion, and buried children young, as poor families so often did. And yet, in that rough cabin, on that winter morning, they held in their arms a son who would one day be remembered when every rich man of his age was forgotten. Picture the everyday quiet of that life in the years before anything happened. Smoke rising straight from a stick chimney into the still cold air. A woman bent over a pot at the hearth, her face lit orange by the coals. A man coming in at dusk with an axe on his shoulder and snow on his boots. A small boy watching the fire with wide and solemn eyes, listening to the wind press against the logs. For most people, most of the time, life was small and near at hand, and the wide world beyond the trees might as well have been the moon. No one in that cabin thought of greatness. No one dreamed of marble halls or of a nation saved. They thought of the winter and whether the corn would last, and whether the baby would live to see the spring. The great struggles that would one day carry this child's name to the ends of the earth were nowhere in sight. The forest lay quiet under its heavy snow, the way a house lies quiet in the last dark hour before anyone is awake. All of it was still to come, but slowly, and not yet. So let the peace of that old wild country settle over you now, as we begin. Dim the lights if they are not already low. Rest your head against the pillow and let your shoulders sink down at last. Breathe in slowly and let it out more slowly still. There is nothing you need to do tonight and nowhere at all you need to go. The fire is banked, the door is barred against the cold, and the long night stretches ahead with all the time in the world. Let us go back, then, gently, back to a cabin in the Kentucky woods, and a child who did not yet know his own name. The Kentucky of Abraham's earliest years was a country still half wild, only lately carved out of the endless forest. The family lived on a hardscrabble farm beside a creek, in a cabin much like the one he was born in, a single room, a dirt floor, a loft above where the children slept. There was an older sister, Sarah, 2 years his senior, gentle and dependable, who would be his closest companion through all the years of childhood. The two of them grew up together in that small dim room, sharing the work and the wonder of a world that reached no further than the trees. It was a childhood of endless labor, for on the frontier even the smallest hands were put to use. Almost as soon as he could walk, the boy was carrying water, fetching wood, dropping seed corn into the furrows behind his father's plow. There were no idle hours, no toys to speak of, no soft indulgences. And yet there were joys, too, of a plain and lasting kind. The cool of the creek in summer, the taste of wild berries, the long stories told around the fire on winter nights, the deep animal comfort of a warm hearth while the wind howled outside in the dark. Schooling, when it came at all, came in fragments. Now and then a wandering teacher would open a rough log schoolhouse for a few weeks or a few months, and the children of the district would walk miles through the woods to sit on split log benches and learn their letters. It was a rude sort of learning, reading, a little writing, a little ciphering, all recited aloud together in a great blur of voices. Abraham went when he could, which was seldom, and all the scattered days of his schooling, added together across his whole life, would amount to less than a single year. But the little he was given, he seized upon with a hunger that startled everyone who knew him. From the first, he loved words. He loved the shapes of the letters and the sounds they made and the way a sentence could carry a whole idea across the years from a stranger's mind into his own. Paper was scarce and precious, so he wrote with a charred stick on a wooden shovel, scraping it clean to write again. He would work a sum on the back of a board and shave it away and work another. Whatever he learned, he held. Whatever he did not understand, it troubled him until he did. When Abraham was 7 years old, his father grew restless once more. There were troubles over the title to the Kentucky land, for the frontier was a tangle of bad deeds and disputed claims, and a poor man could lose his farm to a lawyer's paper through no fault of his own. And so Thomas Lincoln decided, as such men so often did, to pull up stakes and try again further on. He would cross the great river to the north into the newer country of Indiana, where the land was said to be surveyed fair and square, and a man might own his acres free and clear. So in the autumn of the year, the family gathered up what little they owned. A few tools, a few pots, some bedding and seed, and set out into the wilderness. They came at last to the broad Ohio River, that wide gray highway between the settled and the unsettled world, and ferried across into Indiana. Beyond the far bank stood a forest so dense and so unbroken that they had to cut their road as they went, chopping a path through brush and timber mile by weary mile toward the patch of ground Thomas had chosen, deep in the woods. It was late in the year when they reached the place, and the cold was coming. There was no time to raise a proper cabin before winter closed in, and so they built what the frontier called a half-faced camp, a rough shelter of poles and branches, closed on 3 sides and open on the 4th, with a fire kept burning day and night at the open face to hold back the cold. In that miserable shed, little more than a lean-to, the family passed their first Indiana winter, huddled against the flames while the snow piled deep and silent among the trees. Come spring, they set to building in earnest, and here the boy's growing strength began to show. Though he was only 8, Abraham was already tall and unusually strong, and his father put an axe in his hands and set him to work. From that day on, as he later said, that axe was seldom out of his grip until he came of age. He helped to fell the great trees, to split them into logs, to raise the walls of a true cabin at last. The forest that surrounded them was the enemy to be beaten back, and beating it back was the whole labor of their days. Slowly, acre by acre, they made a farm out of the wilderness. They girdled the tall trees to kill them, and cleared the brush, and planted corn among the stumps. They built fences of split rails to keep the stock from the crops. It was brutal, unending work, the same work that had worn out generations of frontier families before them, and the boy grew lean and hard and quiet in the doing of it. His hands, they said, were enormous, and his arms could swing an axe all day without tiring, and he could sink it deeper into a log than any man in the district. Yet even then, those who watched him sensed that his heart was not truly in the axe and the plow. He did his work and did it well, for a boy did as his father bid him. But his mind was always somewhere else, turning over a thing he had read, or puzzling out a question no one else had thought to ask. He would pause at the end of a furrow to rest the horse, and while he rested he would pull a book from inside his shirt and read a page. His father, a practical man with little use for books, thought it a foolish and idle habit, and did not hide his displeasure. For between the father and the son there lay a quiet distance that never quite closed. Thomas Lincoln was a good enough man in his way, honest, hard-working, well-liked, content with the simple round of frontier life. But he could not read, and did not care to, and he could not understand the strange yearning in his son for something beyond the farm. Where the father saw a boy shirking his chores over a book, the mother saw something else entirely. A spark worth guarding, a mind reaching toward a light that she herself had always longed for and never quite been able to reach. That mother, Nancy, is a shadowy figure in the story, for little of her survives beyond the love her son carried for her all his life. She could read, which was rare for a frontier woman, and it is said she read the Bible aloud to her children in the evenings, filling their heads with its grave and beautiful old language. She was thoughtful and tender, and marked by a certain sadness, as though she sensed how short her time would be. In her quiet way, she gave her son the two things that mattered most: the belief that his mind was worth something, and the love of words that would carry him out of the woods. So the years of early boyhood passed, in labor and in the slow clearing of the land, in the warmth of the family fire and the long green silence of the forest. It was a hard life and a narrow one, and by every outward measure a poor one. And yet it was, for a while, a whole and settled world, with a mother's voice at its center. That world was about to be broken. For into the deep woods of Indiana, in the boy's 9th year, there came a quiet and terrible visitor, against which the axe and the strong arm and all the labor of the frontier were of no use at all. It came in the late summer, when the woods were heavy and green, a sickness the frontier folk called the milk sickness. No one then understood its cause, that it came from the milk of cattle that had grazed on a certain pale poisonous plant in the shaded woods. They knew only that it came without warning and killed without mercy, sweeping through a settlement and leaving fresh graves behind. That summer it came to the little community where the Lincolns lived, and one after another the neighbors sickened and died, and there was nothing anyone could do but watch and wait and pray. Then it came into the Lincoln cabin itself. Nancy fell ill, and it was plain almost at once how it would end. For a week or so she lay on her bed in the dim little room, growing weaker by the day, while her husband and her 2 children hovered helpless around her. There was no doctor within reach, and no medicine that would have helped if there had been. On the 7th day, knowing she was dying, she called her children to her and spoke to them softly, and asked them to be good to one another and to their father. And then, quietly, she was gone. She was but 34 years old. There was no minister in that wild country to speak over her, and no coffin to be bought. Thomas Lincoln, a carpenter, took his tools and whipsawed the planks with his own hands, and the boy Abraham helped him, and they made a rough box of green wood. They carried her up a low wooded hill not far from the cabin, and laid her in the ground beneath the trees, and covered her over, and that was all. No stone marked the place for many years. The boy of 9 stood at the raw edge of the grave in the forest silence, and something in him closed over that wound and never fully opened again. The winter that followed was the bleakest of his life. With the mother gone, the small warm center of the household was gone with her, and the cabin fell into a kind of squalor and grief. Sarah, herself only 11, tried bravely to keep the house and cook the meals, but she was a child, and the burden was too great. The 3 of them lived through those cold months in a numb and cheerless way, unwashed and half-fed, the light gone out of the place. It was a motherless, comfortless time, and it left its mark on the boy, a vein of melancholy that would run beneath his whole life. Thomas Lincoln bore it as long as he could, and then he did a wise thing. The following year he journeyed back across the river into Kentucky, to a town where he had known people in his younger days, and there he called upon a widow named Sarah Bush Johnston, a woman he had known before either of them married. She was kindly and capable, with 3 children of her own, and she had been recently widowed. Thomas laid his situation plainly before her. He was a widower with 2 children and a hard farm in Indiana, and he needed a wife, and would she have him? And remarkably, she agreed. When she arrived at the Indiana cabin in a wagon loaded with her own belongings, she found a scene that would have daunted a lesser woman. The motherless children ragged and shy, the cabin bare and cheerless, no floor, no door worth the name, no glass in the window. But Sarah Bush Lincoln was not daunted. She was a woman of energy and warmth, and she set at once to work. She had the children washed and dressed in decent clothes. She had a proper floor laid, and a door hung and the window fixed. And with her came real furniture, real bedding, real comfort, and, most of all, real kindness. For the boy Abraham, her coming was a kind of rescue. From the first, this new mother seemed to understand him as his own father never had. She saw the grave, hungry, book-loving child beneath the woodsman's strength, and rather than trying to change him, she cherished exactly what she found. In later years, she would say that his mind and hers seemed to run together, that he never gave her a cross word or a moment's trouble in all their years, and that he was the best boy she ever knew. He, for his part, called her his angel mother, and loved her to the end of his days. Most precious of all, she took his side in the great quiet struggle of his boyhood, the struggle to learn. Where his father saw idleness in a boy bent over a book, his stepmother saw something worth protecting, and she shielded that flame. She encouraged him to read, defended him when his father grumbled, and made sure he had the light and the leisure, however small, to feed his mind. In a life that gave him few advantages, this was among the greatest. That at the very moment it mattered most, a good woman chose to believe in him. and so the boy read. Books were rare and precious things on the frontier, worth walking many miles to borrow, and he read the few he could find over and over until he knew them nearly by heart. He read the Bible and Aesop's fables and the Pilgrim's Progress. He read a life of George Washington and wept, they say, over the hardships of the Revolution and the greatness of that distant hero. Each book was a door thrown open onto a wider world, and through each door he stepped further from the narrow life of the farm, though his body still swung the axe from dawn to dark. There is a story, often told, that captures the boy exactly. He had borrowed a treasured book, that same Life of Washington, from a neighboring farmer, and one night a storm blew rain through a chink in the cabin wall and soaked it through and ruined it. Mortified and having no money to pay for the damage, the boy walked to the farmer and confessed what had happened and offered to work off the debt. The farmer set him to pulling fodder for 3 long days, and at the end gave him the ruined book to keep. And so, by the labor of his own hands, the boy came to own the first book that was truly his. As he grew into his teens, he grew ever taller until he stood well above 6 feet. A lanky, raw-boned young giant, all long arms and long legs, awkward in his ill-fitting homespun clothes. He was strong beyond the common run of men, and his strength made him useful and admired. But it was his mind and his tongue that made him loved. For he had grown into a great teller of stories, a mimic and a jester, able to hold a crowd of rough farmers helpless with laughter at a country store or a rail splitting. Beneath the melancholy there ran a deep vein of humor, and he learned early how to use it to win men to him. He was known, too, for a quality rarer than strength or wit, a plain, stubborn honesty that everyone remarked upon. He would walk miles to return a few cents given him in error, or to carry a customer the tea he had shorted them by an ounce. It was not calculation. It was simply the grain of the man. In a rough country where a sharp deal was often admired, this tall young fellow was trusted absolutely, and the trust he earned then would follow him all his life. Long before anyone spoke of him as a leader, they spoke of him as Honest Abe. And he began, in these years, to think. Splitting rails, or resting at the end of a furrow, or lying before the fire late at night, his mind worked ceaselessly over the things he read and saw and heard. He could not bear to leave a thing half understood. He would turn it until its meaning came clear, and then he could put it into words so plain that any listener grasped it at once. That gift, of taking a hard thing and making it simple and true, was growing in him quietly, in the woods unnoticed, and it would one day move a whole nation. So the boy became a young man in the Indiana wilderness, shaped by labor and by loss, by the axe and by the book, by a mother taken too soon and a mother sent as if in answer to a prayer. He had almost nothing that the world counts as advantage. But he had a sound and hungry mind, an honest heart, a strong body, and a growing store of borrowed wisdom. And he was beginning dimly to feel the pull of the wider world beyond the trees, the world of towns and rivers and men and ideas that his mother had died still longing for, and that he meant somehow to go and see. When Abraham was 19, a chance came to see something of that wider world at last. A local merchant hired him and another young man to take a flatboat loaded with farm goods down the rivers to the great southern port of New Orleans. A flatboat was a simple thing, a broad raft of rough planks, steered by long oars and carried along mostly by the current, and the journey was one of hundreds of miles, down the Ohio and then the vast Mississippi, through a changing country the boy had never imagined. For a young man who had never been more than a few days' walk from home, it was a voyage to the edge of the known world. Down the wide brown river they drifted, day after day, past forests and bluffs and little river towns, past other boats laden with the produce of the frontier, all bound for the same great market in the south. At night they tied up along the bank and slept beneath the stars, and by day the river carried them on, ever southward into warmer air and stranger country. It was on this journey that the young Lincoln first began to grasp how enormous his country truly was, how many people it held, how many kinds of life, how vast the land beyond his father's few cleared acres. And at the end of the river lay New Orleans, unlike anything he had ever seen. A great bustling port city, crowded and loud and rich, where ships from all the world lay at the wharves and a dozen languages sounded in the streets. To a backwoods youth in homespun clothes, it must have seemed almost a dream, the fine buildings, the markets heaped with goods, the throngs of people, the sheer swarming energy of a real city. He walked its streets with wide eyes, taking it all in, a young giant from the forest set down in the midst of the world's traffic. But in that same city he saw another thing, a thing that lodged in him like a splinter and never worked its way out. For New Orleans was one of the great slave markets of the South, and there, in the open, he saw human beings bought and sold. He saw men and women chained and examined like livestock, saw families parted forever on the auction block, saw the whole vast cruelty of slavery not as a distant idea but as a living scene before his eyes. He said little about it at the time, but those who were with him remembered that something in him went hard and quiet, and that he never forgot what he had seen. He made that long river journey to New Orleans more than once in his young manhood, and each time the sight of slavery struck the same deep, unhappy note in him. He had grown up among people who owned no slaves and were themselves near the bottom of the world's ladder, and perhaps that was part of it. But it went deeper than circumstance. There was in him, from the first, a plain and stubborn sense of fairness, a conviction that no man had the right to wring his bread from the sweat of another man's face. He could not yet say what ought to be done, but he knew in his bones that it was wrong. When he came of age at 21, his father moved the family once again, this time westward into the young state of Illinois, and Abraham dutifully went along and helped them settle and split the rails to fence their new farm. But he was a man now, free to make his own way, and he knew the time had come to leave the family hearth behind. He had no wish to spend his life as his father had, wringing a bare living from the soil. And so, with little more than the clothes on his back and the strength of his arms and the contents of his mind, he struck out on his own into the world. He came at last to a tiny frontier village called New Salem, perched on a bluff above a river in the Illinois prairie, a cluster of some 24 log houses, a mill, a store or two, and a scattering of restless, hopeful settlers. It was a raw new place, full of the optimism of the frontier, certain it was about to grow into a great town. It never did. Within a few years it would fade and all but vanish. But for the young Lincoln, these were golden years, the years in which the awkward woodsman slowly, and half by accident, discovered the man he was meant to become. He arrived as a stranger and a drifter, and he made his living at first however he could, clerking in a store, helping at the mill, taking whatever work a strong and willing young man could find. The village took to him quickly. He was funny and kind and endlessly obliging, and his great store of tales and jokes made him welcome at every fireside and gathering. He would sit of an evening at the store, a crowd around him, spinning stories until the whole room roared. And whatever a man's quarrel or trouble, he found in this tall newcomer a fair and patient listener. His strength, too, soon became the stuff of local legend. Nearby there lived a rough gang of young men known as the Clary's Grove Boys, who prided themselves on being the toughest fellows in the country, and their champion was a wrestler named Jack Armstrong. It was inevitable that they should test the tall newcomer, and so a wrestling match was arranged, the whole village turning out to watch. Accounts of how it ended differ, as such stories will. But this much is sure. Lincoln held his own against their champion so well that the rough boys, who respected nothing but strength, took him at once to their hearts. Having won their respect by his strength, he kept it by his character, and the wild Clary's Grove Boys became his loyal friends and, in time, his stoutest political supporters. It was a small thing, a backwoods wrestling match, and yet it showed something that would mark his whole career. An uncommon gift for winning over even those who began as rivals, for turning a challenge into a friendship. Men who set out to best him ended by following him. There was something in his open, homely, good-humored strength that made people trust him and want him on their side. In New Salem, he tried his hand at keeping a store of his own, going into business with a partner. It was not a success. Lincoln had 100 gifts, but a head for business was not among them. He was too fond of reading behind the counter and swapping stories with the customers, and his partner was fond of the bottle, and the store, as he later put it, winked out. Worse, when it failed, it left him saddled with a crushing burden of debt. A sum so large he ruefully called it the national debt, which he insisted on repaying to the last penny, though it took him years of hard work to do it. That insistence on paying every debt, when he might easily have walked away as others did, only deepened the trust the community placed in him. And little by little, the village found uses for his particular gifts. He was made the postmaster, a small post that let him read every newspaper that passed through his hands before he delivered it, and read them he did hungrily, drinking in news of the wider world and the great questions of the day. And he took up the trade of surveyor, teaching himself the geometry he needed out of borrowed books, tramping the prairie with chain and compass to lay out roads and farms and towns. Then came a brief and almost comic interlude of soldiering. When a war broke out on the frontier, a short, sad conflict with a band of the native Sauk people led by a chief named Black Hawk, Lincoln volunteered with the local militia, and to his surprise and pleasure his companions elected him their captain. He saw no fighting. His service was a matter of long marches and short rations and burying the dead of other men's battles. But he always spoke of that election, of being chosen captain by his fellows, as one of the proudest and most gratifying moments of his early life. For it revealed to him a thing he had not quite known about himself, that men would follow where he led. He was still a poor and unschooled young man, in debt and unsure of his path, splitting rails and running chains across the prairie to keep body and soul together. But he was well liked and well trusted, quick of mind and honest of heart, and the community had begun, without quite meaning to look to him. And now a new and larger ambition was stirring in him. An ambition to do something, to be something, to take a hand in the great affairs he read of every day in the newspapers. Even before the militia march, and again after it, he had set his sights on something bold for a young man in his position, a seat in the Illinois legislature. He announced himself a candidate, drafting a long, earnest handbill setting out his views for better roads and rivers, for schools, for the improvement of his adopted country. It was a remarkable document for a self-taught youth of 23, plain and sincere, closing with a touchingly honest confession of how much he wished for the esteem of his fellow men, and how he would bear defeat, if it came, as one used to disappointments. Defeat did come that first time. He lost the election, though his own New Salem neighbors, who knew him best, voted for him almost to a man. But he was not discouraged for long. He turned back to bettering himself, more determined than ever, and he fixed upon a goal that would have seemed absurd for a rail splitter with less than a year of schooling. He would become a lawyer. It was among the most respected callings in the country, the common road to public life, and it was open, in that rough and ready age, to any man who could master the books and satisfy the court that he knew the law. And so he taught himself the law, as he had taught himself everything else, alone and by main force of will. He borrowed heavy legal volumes and carried them back to New Salem and read them lying under a tree or stretched before the fire, his long legs propped up the wall, reading far into the night. He studied grammar, too, walking miles to borrow a textbook when he learned that his plain speech might be bettered, mastering its rules until he could write and speak with a precision that belied his backwoods origins. Whatever he lacked in schooling, he made up in a patient, ferocious, unresting labor of the mind. It is worth pausing on this, for it is the heart of the man. He had no teacher, no college, no learned family, none of the advantages that smoothed the path for other men. What he had was an extraordinary power of concentration, a memory that held fast to whatever it grasped, and above all a burning wish to understand. He would lie awake, it was said, wrestling with a problem until he had it clear, unable to rest until the thing made sense. And once it was clear in his own mind, he had the rarer gift still of making it clear to others, of stripping away all that was fancy and false until only the plain truth stood. Amid all this labor there fell a great sorrow, one that the legend of Lincoln has long dwelt upon. In New Salem there was a young woman named Anne Rutledge, gentle and well-loved, the daughter of the tavern keeper, and it is widely believed that Lincoln loved her dearly, and she him. But in the summer of her youth she fell ill of a fever and died, and the young man was cast into a grief so black that his friends feared for his reason, and watched him closely lest he do himself harm. Whatever the exact truth of that old story, it is certain that in these years he knew a depth of sorrow that few ever plumb. That melancholy never wholly left him. It was there in the lines of his face even in youth, a settled sadness beneath the jokes and the laughter, and it would deepen as his life went on and his burdens grew. Some men are broken by such sorrow. He was not. Instead, it seemed to sink into him and become a kind of strength, a deep and patient sympathy with the suffering of others, a gravity that steadied him, a sense that life was a serious and sorrowful business not to be wasted. The laughter and the melancholy lived side by side in him always, two halves of one large and complicated soul. He ran again for the legislature, and this time he won. At 25, the poor rail splitter, the failed storekeeper, the self-taught surveyor, put on a new suit of clothes bought with borrowed money and rode off to the state capitol to take his seat among the lawmakers of Illinois. It was a long way from the dirt-floored cabin of his birth, and he had traveled it entirely by his own effort, one hard step at a time. He was still young, still poor, still rough in his manners and his speech. But he had arrived at last upon the public stage, and he would not leave it again. In the legislature he found his footing quickly. He was shrewd, hard-working, and well-liked, and he had a knack for the practical business of politics, for the give and take, the bargaining and persuading, by which things actually got done. He allied himself with the party of internal improvement and national progress, believing with all his heart that government could and should help ordinary men to better their lot, as he was bettering his own. He worked to bring roads and canals and railroads to the raw young state, to open its rivers, to knit its scattered settlements into a prospering whole. He was re-elected again and again and became a leader among his fellow lawmakers. And in these years he did a thing that took real courage, and that pointed toward the great struggle of his later life. The legislature passed resolutions defending slavery and condemning those who spoke against it, as most such bodies then did. Lincoln, almost alone, refused to go along. With a single ally, he entered a formal protest, declaring plainly that slavery was founded on both injustice and bad policy. It was a mild statement by later standards and a lonely one at the time. But it was on the record, and it was true, and he meant it. Meanwhile, he had at last completed his long solitary study of the law, and had satisfied the court, and had been admitted to the bar. He was a lawyer now, the very thing that had seemed so impossibly far above him a few years before. And so, with the little village of New Salem already beginning to fade and empty around him, he made ready to leave it, and to move to the growing town of Springfield, the new capital of Illinois, where a young lawyer might build a real practice and a real career. He rode in on a borrowed horse, with all he owned in a pair of saddlebags, and a heart full of hope and doubt. The New Salem years were over, but they had made him. He had come to that little bluff-top village a raw and drifting boy, unsure of everything but his own strength, and he was leaving it a lawyer and a legislator, a man with a name and a future. He had failed at business and triumphed at politics, buried a love and survived his grief, taught himself law and grammar and the ways of men. The village itself would soon be gone, its cabins pulled down, its streets returned to prairie grass. But it had done its work. It had been the forge in which the woodsman was made into something more. And through it all, in the store and the legislature and the long nights of study, one thing in him had been quietly growing: the power of his speech. He had learned to reason closely and to speak plainly, to build an argument step by patient step, so that a listener was carried along almost without knowing it, until he found he agreed. He seasoned his logic with homely stories and country humor that made hard points easy and stern men smile. It was a style all his own, born of the frontier and the borrowed books, and it would one day be counted among the greatest ever heard in the English tongue. So we leave the young man on the road to Springfield, riding toward the next chapter of his life. No longer a boy, not yet the figure the world would come to know, but something in between. A rising country lawyer with mud on his boots and Shakespeare in his head, an easy laugh and a secret sorrow, a plain, honest heart and a mind as sharp as the axe he had swung so long. Rest now if you are drifting. The hard childhood is behind him. The great trials are still far ahead. And for a little while, in the growing town on the prairie, there would be something like happiness. Springfield in those days was a bustling, muddy, ambitious town, newly made the capital of Illinois, its streets full of lawyers and politicians and merchants all on the make. Into it rode the tall young Lincoln, friendless and nearly penniless, to begin his life as an attorney. He formed a partnership with an established lawyer and slowly built up a practice and found his place in the busy life of the town. He was awkward still and poor still and painfully aware of his rough origins among the more polished men of the capital. But he had his wits and his honesty, and these carried him far. Much of a prairie lawyer's work was done not in Springfield at all, but out on the circuit, the great loop of county courthouses scattered across the wide Illinois prairie, which the judges and lawyers rode together twice a year, from town to town, trying whatever cases came before them. For weeks at a time Lincoln lived this wandering life, jogging across the open country on horseback, sleeping to a bed in rough taverns, arguing cases by day and swapping stories by night around the fire with his fellow lawyers. He loved it, this rough fraternity of the road, and on the circuit his fame as a storyteller and an advocate grew and spread. As a lawyer he was formidable, though not in the flashy way of some. He was not learned in the fine points and cared little for them. His power lay in his grasp of the essential matter of a case, his ability to see straight to its heart and to lay it before a jury in language so clear and homely that 12 plain farmers understood it perfectly. He would concede every small point to his opponent, seeming almost to argue the other side, and then fasten upon the one great point on which the whole case truly turned, and drive it home so that the verdict was all but won. And he was, above all, honest, famously, almost troublesomely honest. He would not take a case he believed to be unjust, and if he found himself in the wrong of a matter, he could scarcely bring himself to argue it at all. He counseled clients to settle rather than sue, telling them there was business enough in the world without stirring up needless quarrels. In an age and a profession not always known for scruple, this tall, homely, honest lawyer stood out, and men brought him their troubles knowing they would get plain dealing and sound sense, whatever else they got. It was in Springfield society that he met the woman who would become his wife. Mary Todd was in nearly every way his opposite. Well-born and well-schooled, the daughter of a prominent Kentucky family, quick and cultivated and ambitious, at home in the polished drawing rooms where he felt so out of place. Yet something drew them together. She saw in this rough, brilliant, melancholy man a greatness others missed, and believed, they say, that he would one day be president. Their courtship was stormy, broken off once in doubt and anguish and then resumed, but in the end they married. It was not always an easy marriage, and much has been made of its trials. They were very different souls and both were burdened. He by his deep spells of melancholy, she by a nervous, excitable temper that grief would in time make worse. There were hard days and sharp words in the Lincoln household, as there are in most. But there was also real love and real partnership. She kept his house and raised his children and pushed his ambition forward when his own doubts held him back. He bore her moods with a weary patience and a deep tenderness. Together, through much sorrow, they made a home. And that home filled in time with children, 4 sons, born across the Springfield years, whom Lincoln loved with an open and indulgent heart. He was, by the standards of that stern age, a remarkably gentle and playful father, romping on the floor with his boys, carrying them on his shoulders, letting them run wild through his law office and tumble his papers while he worked. Having known so little tenderness in his own hard childhood, he lavished it on his sons. The sound of their laughter and the sight of them at play were among the few pure joys of his careworn life. Yet sorrow found even here, as it found him everywhere. One of the 4 boys, a bright little fellow named Eddie, sickened and died before he was 4 years old, and the loss struck both parents hard. It was the frontier grief of his own childhood come round again in a new form, the small grave, the empty place at the table, the unhealing wound. Lincoln bore it, as he bore all his griefs, quietly and deeply, folding it away inside himself. But it left another shadow on a heart already well acquainted with darkness, and drew him and Mary, for all their differences, closer in their shared mourning. In the midst of these Springfield years, his old ambition carried him briefly onto the national stage. He was elected to a single term in the Congress of the United States and went off to Washington to serve. It was not a triumph. He was one obscure new member among many, and his most notable act, a bold and principled stand against a war with Mexico that he believed unjust, and had been begun on a false pretext, was unpopular at home and did his career no good. He served his term, spoke his mind, and came back to Springfield a seeming failure in national politics, and turned again to the law. For a few years, then, he set politics aside almost entirely and gave himself to his practice and his family. He prospered as never before, becoming one of the leading lawyers of the state, arguing important cases, earning at last a comfortable living. He bought a good house in Springfield, the only home he would ever own. He seemed, to all appearances, a man who had found his place at last, a successful attorney, a devoted father, a pillar of his community, his youthful dreams of glory quietly set aside for the solid contentments of middle life. He was past 40. The great work of his life had not yet begun. But beneath the calm surface, the old questions still burned in him. He read and thought and brooded on the state of his country, and on the one great wrong at its heart that would not let him rest. He had never made his peace with slavery. The memory of the New Orleans auction block was still in him, and the plain conviction, held since boyhood, that it was a monstrous injustice for one man to own another. He kept these thoughts mostly to himself in those quiet years. But they were deepening in him and gathering force, waiting only for the hour that would call them forth. For the country itself was changing and darkening in ways that no thoughtful man could ignore. The question of slavery, long uneasily managed by a series of careful compromises, was growing harder to contain with every passing year. The nation was spreading westward across the continent, and with each new territory came the same bitter, unavoidable question. Would this new land be slave or free? On the answer hung the whole future balance of the republic, and around it the two halves of the country, the free North and the slaveholding South, were beginning to circle each other with a rising anger. It was a quarrel as old as the nation itself. The men who founded the republic had known slavery was a wrong, and had hoped, many of them, that it would fade away in time of its own accord. Instead it had grown rich and powerful on the cotton of the deep South, grown bold in its own defense, grown from a thing men apologized for into a thing men praised as a positive good. And the free states of the North, filling with people who would not abide its spread, grew ever more set against it. The old compromises were straining. The country was pulling itself in two. And into that gathering storm, Abraham Lincoln was about to be drawn. The thing that woke him came in the year 1854. For a whole generation, an uneasy peace had rested on a great bargain called the Missouri Compromise, which had drawn a line across the map of the West and declared that slavery might exist below it but never above. It was not justice, but it was a boundary, a limit, a promise that the vast northern territories would be forever free. Men on both sides had come to rely on it. And then, almost overnight, that old line was swept away, and the country was set on fire. It was done by a law called the Kansas-Nebraska Act, pushed through by Lincoln's great rival and fellow Illinoisan, the powerful Senator Stephen Douglas. Douglas proposed to let the settlers of each new territory decide the question of slavery for themselves, a principle he called popular sovereignty, and dressed up as democracy itself. But its effect was to tear down the old barrier and throw open to slavery the vast lands that had been promised to freedom forever. The North erupted in outrage. And in Springfield, a lawyer who had all but left politics felt something in him catch fire. As he himself later put it, the passage of that act aroused him as he had never been aroused before. The old contentment fell away. The half-buried convictions of a lifetime came surging up. He saw with a terrible clarity that the question could no longer be dodged or managed or wished away, that the nation must decide, once and for all, what it truly meant to be. Was it, or was it not, dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal? Everything he was, everything he had taught himself and thought and felt, now gathered itself around that single question. And he threw himself back into the arena. He began to speak, and when he spoke, men listened as they had not before. Gone was the mere clever politician of the circuit. In his place stood a man on fire with a great conviction, reasoning with a depth and a moral force that astonished those who had known only the storyteller and the lawyer. In a series of powerful speeches, he laid out the case against the spread of slavery, not with the wild fury of the abolitionist, but with a slow, unanswerable logic that built like a rising tide, until his listeners felt the ground of the argument shift beneath their feet. He did not, in these years, call for slavery to be abolished where it already existed. He did not believe the Constitution gave him or anyone that power, and he feared the ruin that a sudden overturning might bring. But he drew a bright line and held it without flinching. Slavery must not be allowed to spread 1 foot further. It must be hemmed in where it stood, confined and contained, put, as he said, in the course of ultimate extinction. Let it spread no more, and let the whole moral weight of the nation be set against it, and in time, he believed, it would wither and die. That was his ground, and he would not be moved from it. Above all, he brought the argument back again and again to a single moral root. Slavery was wrong. Not merely unwise, not merely inconvenient, but wrong, a monstrous injustice, a denial of the plainest truth on which the whole nation had been founded. If the black man was a man, he said, then the ancient words applied to him as fully as to any other, that he too was created equal, that he too had a right to the fruits of his own labor. Strip away every clever argument, and it came down to that. And once a thing was seen to be wrong, there could be no right way to do it and no right to spread it. His words began to travel beyond Illinois, carried in the newspapers to a North hungry for a voice that could say plainly what so many were feeling. The old party he had belonged to was dying, torn apart by the very question that was tearing the country apart. In its place, a new party was rising, born expressly to resist the spread of slavery into the territories, the Republican Party. And Lincoln, with his growing fame and his moderate, principled, unshakable stand, was drawn steadily toward its front rank until he became its foremost man in all the West. Meanwhile, the country itself was sliding toward violence. In the newly opened territory of Kansas, the two sides rushed in to seize control, and the struggle over whether it would be slave or free turned bloody, with raids and killings and burnings, so that men called it Bleeding Kansas. Far away in the marble halls of the Senate, a Northern man who had spoken against slavery was beaten nearly to death at his own desk by a Southern one. The bonds that held the nation together were fraying, thread by thread, and thoughtful men on both sides began to speak, in low and fearful voices, of the possibility of civil war. Then came a blow from the highest court in the land that seemed to slam every door at once. In the case of an enslaved man named Dred Scott, who had sued for his freedom, the Supreme Court ruled not only against him but against the whole cause of freedom itself. It declared that a black man had no rights that a white man was bound to respect, that he could not be a citizen at all, and, more sweeping still, that Congress had no power to keep slavery out of any territory whatsoever. At a stroke, the very ground on which the new party stood had been declared unconstitutional. To Lincoln and those who thought with him, it was a stunning and ominous ruling. It meant that slavery could not lawfully be excluded from anywhere, that the dream of a free West was, in the eyes of the law, no dream at all but a delusion. And it pointed, he feared, toward something worse still, toward a day not far off, when slavery might be declared lawful not only in the territories but in the free states themselves, and the whole nation, North and South alike, be made a land of masters and slaves. The trap seemed to be closing, and he resolved to fight it with everything he had. For he had come to see the struggle now in its largest terms, not as a quarrel over this territory or that, but as a contest for the very soul and survival of the Republic. He believed the nation could not go on forever half slave and half free, that it must, in time, become all one thing or all the other. Either the friends of slavery would arrest its spread and set it on the road to extinction, or its enemies would be worn down, and it would spread until it was lawful everywhere. There was no permanent middle ground. The house was dividing, and it could not stand divided forever. And so, in the summer of 1858, he prepared to challenge the mighty Stephen Douglas himself, the most powerful man in the state, for his seat in the Senate of the United States. It was an audacious thing, for Douglas was a national figure, a giant of the age, and Lincoln still, in the world's eyes, a mere country lawyer. But Lincoln had found his cause and his voice, and he did not shrink from the contest. On the evening he was chosen to make the challenge, he rose before the assembled Republicans of Illinois and spoke words that would ring down through all the years to come. A house divided against itself, he told them, cannot stand. He believed the government could not endure permanently half slave and half free. He did not expect the house to fall, but he did expect it to cease to be divided. It would become all one thing or all the other. The words were plain, drawn from the old scripture his mother had read him as a child, and they cut straight to the bone of the nation's crisis. Some of his friends thought them too bold, too dangerous, and feared they would cost him the election. Perhaps they did. But they were true, and the whole country heard them. With those words, the tall lawyer from Springfield stepped into the front rank of the nation's life and set himself squarely against the tide of his times. The quiet years were over, The years of struggle had begun. Ahead lay a contest that would carry his name across the country, and then a greater contest that would carry it into history, and then a burden heavier than any American had ever borne. But for now, rest. The storm is still only gathering on the horizon. Let it gather in the distance, low and far off, while you drift down into the quiet of the night. The contest between Lincoln and Douglas that autumn became one of the most famous in the nation's history. Across the prairies of Illinois, the two men met 7 times in a series of open-air debates before enormous crowds, thousands upon thousands of farmers and townsfolk streaming in by wagon and by train from miles around, filling the town squares, standing for hours in the sun and dust to hear the two champions argue the future of the country. There were bands and banners and cannon fire, and beneath the noise and spectacle, a debate of the deepest seriousness on the gravest question of the age. The two men could hardly have been more different to look upon. Douglas was short and thick and powerful, splendidly dressed, a famous orator with a booming voice and a commanding presence, every inch the great senator. Lincoln beside him seemed almost absurd, enormously tall and thin and stooped, awkward in his rumpled clothes, his voice high and reedy when he began, his manner homely and plain. Yet as he warmed to his argument, the awkwardness fell away, and the plainness became its own kind of power, and the tall man's slow, clear reasoning began to tell against the great senator's practiced thunder. Douglas argued his doctrine of popular sovereignty, that each territory should decide the matter for itself, and that the great thing was not whether slavery was right or wrong, but that the people should be left free to choose. He appealed to the weariness of ordinary men with the whole exhausting quarrel, and to the deep prejudices of the age, painting Lincoln as a wild-eyed radical who wished to overturn the natural order and set the races on a level. He was formidable and shrewd, and he gave no ground, and many who heard him were persuaded. But Lincoln bored in relentlessly upon the one point Douglas most wished to avoid, the simple question of right and wrong. You may call it popular sovereignty, he said, you may dress it in the language of freedom and choice, but at the bottom of it lies the claim that there is nothing wrong in one man making a slave of another, and that is the real issue, and it will go on being the issue after these poor tongues of Judge Douglas and myself are silent. He forced the moral question to the surface again and again, and would not let it be buried under clever talk of process and choice. He pressed Douglas, too, into a corner that would cost the senator dearly. If the Supreme Court had ruled that slavery could not be kept out of any territory, Lincoln asked, then how could the people of a territory keep it out, as Douglas claimed they could? The two positions could not both be true. Douglas wriggled free with an answer that satisfied his Illinois audience but enraged the slaveholding South, which now saw him as a traitor to their cause. In pinning him thus, Lincoln lost the immediate battle but shaped the larger war, splitting his rival's party and clearing his own path to greater things. When the votes were counted, Lincoln lost. By the workings of the system as it then stood, Douglas kept his Senate seat, and the country lawyer went down to another defeat, the latest in a long life of them. He felt it keenly as he felt all his failures. It was, he said, a slip and not a fall, but it was bitter all the same to have come so far and reached so high, and to fall short once more. He turned back, weary and in debt from the campaign, to his neglected law practice, thinking perhaps that his great chance had come and gone. But he was wrong about that, wonderfully wrong. For though he had lost the seat, he had won something far greater, a name. The debates had been printed and reprinted in newspapers across the whole country, and through them the nation had discovered him, this tall, strange, homely man from the prairies who could reason like a philosopher and speak like a prophet and yet remain so plainly one of the common people. In losing to the great Douglas, the unknown Lincoln had made himself known from Maine to Missouri. And thoughtful men in the young Republican Party began, quietly, to wonder about him. His fame carried him east, to the great cities he had never seen, and there he set the seal upon his rising reputation. In New York, before a critical and sophisticated audience that half expected a backwoods buffoon, he delivered a mighty address, a masterpiece of close reasoning and moral power, weeks in the careful making, that proved beyond dispute the case against the spread of slavery and against the men who threatened to break the Union over it. The learned crowd, won over utterly, rose to him in a roar. Overnight, the Western lawyer was a serious man for the highest office in the land. And so, as the fateful year of 1860 opened, the once impossible thought had become a real and growing thing. That this poor boy from the Kentucky cabin, this rail splitter and circuit lawyer, this man twice beaten for the Senate, might be made President of the United States. He himself scarcely dared believe it, and spoke of it with his usual dry modesty. But his friends believed it and worked for it, and the great tide of the times was flowing his way, toward a plain, honest, moderate Western man who hated slavery but loved the Union, and might just hold the middle ground where the extremes had failed. When the new party gathered in Chicago that summer to choose its candidate, there were greater and more famous men in the running, polished Eastern statesmen with long records and powerful friends. Lincoln was reckoned a long shot, a favorite son of Illinois, a second choice at best. But that was his strength. The famous men had made famous enemies. The moderate rail splitter had offended almost no one. As the great men knocked each other out, the convention turned, ballot by ballot, toward the tall Westerner who could carry the crucial states, until, on the third ballot, the prize was suddenly his. The news reached him in Springfield, where he had been waiting in an agony of suspense, and the town went wild with joy, bonfires and cannon and cheering crowds surging to his door. He was the nominee of his party for President of the United States. It was a staggering height for a man who had begun with nothing, and he met it, as he met most things, with a grave and quiet steadiness beneath the outward calm. He knew, better than any of the celebrants, what a fearful burden he was reaching for, and into what dark and uncharted country the office might lead him. The election that followed, in the autumn of 1860, was like no other in the nation's history, for the country itself was coming apart even as it voted. The old parties had shattered along the great fault line of slavery, and four candidates now divided the field, North against South, faction against faction. Lincoln's name did not even appear on the ballot in most of the southern states. There he was reviled as a deadly enemy, a man whose election, the fire eaters swore, would be the signal for the South to leave the Union altogether. The whole country held its breath. On election night, he sat up late in the telegraph office in Springfield, reading the returns as they clicked in over the wires from across the nation. Slowly, state by northern state, the count went his way. The great free North, filling with people who would not see slavery spread, had spoken with one voice. Before the night was out, it was certain. Abraham Lincoln of Illinois was elected the 16th President of the United States. He walked home alone through the quiet streets in the small hours, and it is said that he looked less like a man who had won a great prize than one who had shouldered a great weight. For he understood what many in the cheering North did not yet grasp, that his victory might mean not triumph but catastrophe. The South had warned again and again that it would not submit to his election, and the South, he feared, had meant it. Somewhere below the celebrations, he could hear the deep foundations of the country beginning to crack. He had reached at last the summit of his long climb, from the dirt floor of the cabin to the highest office in the land. And he found waiting for him there not glory, but the gravest crisis the Republic had ever faced. The blow was not long in falling. Within weeks of the election, before Lincoln had even taken office, the state of South Carolina made good its long threat and declared itself out of the Union. No longer, it said, a part of the United States at all, but a free and separate nation. One after another, through that dark winter, the states of the Deep South followed. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas, each solemnly voting to sever the bond and go its own way. The union that the founders had made, and that had held for 80 years, was splitting before the world's eyes. The seceding states came together and formed a new nation of their own, the Confederate States of America, with its own president and its own flag and its own government, built openly and explicitly upon the cornerstone of slavery. They seized the forts and arsenals and customs houses within their borders, and made ready to defend their new independence by force if need be. And still Lincoln was not yet president. The old administration drifted and dithered through the crisis, doing little, while the country came apart, and the long, agonizing winter wore on toward his inauguration. It was a strange and terrible interval. Lincoln, still in Springfield, could only watch and wait, forbidden by custom to act before he took the oath, yet seeing the nation dissolve week by week. He held his peace in public, but in private his course was already fixed, and it never wavered. He would offer the South every assurance about slavery where it already existed. He had no wish and no power, he said, to touch it there. But on the one essential point he would not yield an inch. The Union was perpetual, secession was unlawful, and no state had the right to break the nation apart. That he would defend. Compromises were floated, as they always had been in the great crises before. Schemes to patch the quarrel over once more, to extend the old lines, to guarantee slavery forever in exchange for peace. But Lincoln quietly set his face against any bargain that would betray the very principle he had been elected to uphold, any deal that would let slavery spread again into the territories. On that he was immovable. Let there be no compromise, he wrote, on the question of extending slavery. Hold firm as with a chain of steel. He would seek peace by every honorable means, but not by surrendering the ground on which he stood. At last the time came for him to leave Springfield and travel east to be inaugurated. On a gray February morning, he stood on the rear platform of his train and spoke a few halting words of farewell to the neighbors who had gathered in the rain to see him off. He was leaving, he said, not knowing when or whether he might ever return, to take up a task greater than that which had rested upon Washington himself. He asked for their prayers and commended them to God, and the train pulled slowly away. He never saw his hometown again. The journey to Washington wound slowly across the country, through cheering crowds in the northern cities, and it ended in secrecy and fear. For as he neared the capital, his guardians uncovered what they believed to be a plot to murder him as he passed through the slaveholding city of Baltimore, and they hurried him through by night, in disguise, unannounced, to bring him safe to Washington in the darkness before dawn. It was a mortifying, furtive arrival for a new president, and his enemies mocked him for it. But he was alive, and he was in the capital, and the hour of his great trial had come. Washington itself in those days was a raw, unfinished city, half-built and muddy, the great dome of its capital still only a skeleton of iron rising against the sky, a fitting image, some thought, of the half-finished, endangered Union it served. The city seethed with fear and rumor and divided loyalties, ringed about by slave states, uncertain whether it too might be swept into secession or seized by force. Into this uneasy capital came the tall, weary, untried man from Illinois to take up the reins of a government that was, quite literally, falling apart in his hands. On the appointed day in March, he stood before the unfinished Capitol, in the open air, before a great anxious crowd and a country hanging on his every word, and took the oath as President of the United States. And then he spoke, reaching out, even now, to the angry South, in words of patience and of hope. "We are not enemies," he said, "but friends. We must not be enemies. Though passion may have strained, it must not break the bonds of our affection." He pleaded with them to pause, to reflect, to draw back from the abyss before it was too late. He would not attack them, he promised. The government would not assail the South. There would be no war unless the South began it. In their hands, and not in his, he told them, lay the momentous issue of civil war. He had taken a solemn oath to preserve, protect, and defend the Union, and that oath he meant to keep, but he would keep it, if he could, in peace. And he closed with words of aching beauty, speaking of the mystic cords of memory that bound the whole nation together, and that would yet, he prayed, swell again to the better angels of our nature. It was a masterful appeal, firm and tender at once, and in the North it was widely admired. But in the South it fell on deaf and hardened ears. The men who had led the states out of the Union were past listening. They had made their choice and staked everything upon it, and no words, however wise or kind, could now call them back. The two halves of the country stood glaring at each other across a widening gulf, and between them, in the harbors of the South, a few small islands of federal ground still held out, forts flying the old flag amid the new Confederacy, waiting for the spark. The most fateful of these was a fort in the harbor of Charleston in South Carolina, where the whole crisis had begun, a fort called Sumter, held by a small band of Federal soldiers, ringed round by the guns of the new Confederacy and running low on food. It became at once the focus of the whole nation's dread. If Lincoln abandoned it, he would confess the Union broken. If he tried to hold it, he might light the fuse of war. For weeks he agonized over the choice, sleepless and careworn, feeling the whole terrible weight of it come down upon his single conscience. In the end, he found a course of quiet genius. He would not attack, and he would not abandon the fort. He would simply send it food, send bread to hungry men, and tell the South plainly that he was doing so and nothing more. If war came now, it would come because the South had fired upon an errand of mercy, upon the mere provisioning of a hungry garrison under its own flag. He would not strike the first blow. But he would not haul down the flag either. And so he laid the fearful choice squarely where he believed it belonged, in the hands of the men who had broken the peace. The relief ships set sail for Charleston, and the South understood the challenge and chose war. In the dark hours before dawn, the Confederate guns ringing the harbor opened fire upon the fort, and the flash and thunder of their cannon lit the southern sky. The long-dreaded thing had come at last. After all the years of quarrel and compromise, of speeches and warnings and desperate hopes for peace, the nation had fallen at last into the abyss of civil war, and it would be Abraham Lincoln's terrible task to lead it through. The fall of Fort Sumter, after a day and a night of bombardment, changed everything in a moment. The garrison, out of ammunition and hope, hauled down the flag and surrendered, and the news flashed across the country like lightning. In the North, the long paralysis of the winter broke at last into a great surge of anger and resolve. Men who had wavered now rallied, and the cry went up on every side to save the Union. Lincoln called upon the states for troops, 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion, and from every northern town and farm the young men came pouring forward to answer him. But the guns of Sumter had also forced a fearful choice upon the states that lay between, the border states where loyalties were torn. Several more of them now went out to join the Confederacy, and among them was Virginia, oldest and proudest of them all, whose loss was a heavy blow, and whose soil would drink the most blood of any in the war. Yet others, wavering on the knife's edge, Lincoln labored with all his cunning and patience to hold. Kentucky above all, the state of his own birth, whose loss, he said, would be very nearly the loss of the whole game. Hold the border, and the Union might yet win. And so the lines were drawn, and a divided nation set about the terrible business of making war upon itself. It was a strange and heartbreaking kind of war, a war of brother against brother in the most literal sense. Friends who had trained together now facing each other across the field, families split down the middle, a country that had been one people now tearing at its own flesh. Both sides, in that first hot flush, imagined it would be short and glorious, over in a season, decided in a battle or two. Both sides were terribly, tragically wrong. It would last 4 years and consume a whole generation. The illusion of a short war died on a July field in Virginia, at a creek called Bull Run, in the first great battle of the conflict. The Green Northern Army marched out from Washington toward the enemy, so certain of easy victory that sightseers followed in carriages to watch the show. For a while it seemed the Union would win, and then the lines broke, and the raw troops dissolved into a panicked, chaotic flight back toward the capital, soldiers and sightseers together, in a long, humiliating rout. The North was stunned. The dream of a quick and painless triumph was gone for good. It was a hard and sobering lesson, and Lincoln took it to heart faster than almost anyone. He saw now that this would be no 90-day affair, but a long and grinding war that would demand vast armies, vast resources, and above all a vast and stubborn endurance. He set himself to build that endurance. He called for hundreds of thousands more men, for years of service, not months. He gave the shattered Eastern Army to a brilliant young general named McClellan, who set to work with great energy and skill, drilling the beaten troops into a real army, magnificent on parade. George McClellan was in many ways a gift to the Union, a superb organizer, adored by his soldiers, who took a demoralized mob and forged it into a proud and disciplined host. But he had one fatal flaw as a commander: he would not fight. Cautious to the point of paralysis, forever convinced that the enemy outnumbered him, forever demanding more men and more time, he drilled and paraded his splendid army month after month and would not lead it into battle. And Lincoln, hungry for action, chafed and pleaded and prodded, and grew slowly to despair of ever moving his reluctant general at all. Here began one of the great trials of Lincoln's war leadership, the long, weary search for a general who would fight. For much of the war he was cursed with commanders who were timid or slow or quarrelsome, or simply not equal to the terrible task, while across the lines the South was blessed with bold and gifted leaders who wrung victory after victory from their smaller means. Again and again Lincoln would raise a general up, and hope and be disappointed and cast about for another. It was a bitter, grinding education, and he paid for it in defeats and in rivers of his soldiers' blood. And through it all he was learning to be a war leader himself, teaching himself the art of command as he had once taught himself law and grammar, by main force of will. He borrowed books on strategy from the Library of Congress and studied them late into the night. He pored over maps, followed the movements of the armies, sent a ceaseless stream of shrewd and searching telegrams to his generals in the field. He had never been a soldier, and yet his native good sense often saw the heart of a military problem more clearly than his trained commanders did, and history has judged his instincts sound. He bore, too, the whole vast weight of the war upon his own spirit, and it aged him terribly. The photographs tell the tale better than any words. The tall man growing gaunt and gray and deeply lined, the eyes sinking into hollows, the whole face carved ever deeper by care and sorrow, until in a few short years he seemed to age a lifetime. He slept little and ate less. He walked the corridors of the White House in the small hours, unable to rest. Upon his single conscience lay the lives of hundreds of thousands, and the fate of the nation, and he felt every ounce of it. Yet even in the darkest press of the war, the old Lincoln never wholly vanished, the storyteller, the humorist, the man of deep and homely kindness. He would break the tension of a grim cabinet meeting with a funny tale that left even his stern advisors laughing despite themselves. The humor, he said, was the medicine that kept him from breaking under the strain. He was endlessly accessible, letting ordinary people crowd into his office with their troubles and petitions, listening to each with patience. And his mercy became famous, forever pardoning the frightened boy soldier sentenced to be shot for sleeping at his post. For all his vast burdens, he could never harden his heart to the suffering of the individual man. He visited the hospitals and walked among the wounded, and moved among the soldiers' camps, and they came to love him for it. This awkward, kindly, sorrowing giant who seemed to carry the grief of the whole war in his own face. Father Abraham, the soldiers called him. He signed the death warrants that duty required with a heavy hand, and seized upon every excuse to spare a life, and wept in private over the endless lists of the fallen that crossed his desk each day. But no public grief, however great, wounded him so deeply as the private sorrow that struck his own household in the second winter of the war. His little son Willie, a bright, gentle, thoughtful boy of 11, the child most like his father, the apple of his eye, fell ill of a fever and, after weeks of suffering, died in the White House itself. It was the cruelest blow of Lincoln's life. The strong man who bore the weight of a warring nation was utterly broken by the loss of his boy, and shut himself away, and wept as though his heart would never mend. For his wife Mary, the loss was heavier still, and she never truly recovered from it. Her grief tipped over into something wild and inconsolable. She took to her bed for weeks, and wore mourning for years, and her already fragile nerves were shaken to their foundation. The White House, which should have been a place of high purpose, became for a time a house of mourning, its shutters drawn, its halls silent with sorrow. And Lincoln, who had his own bottomless grief to bear, had now to bear his wife's as well, and to hold what remained of his family together in the dark. How he endured it all, the war, the defeats, the crushing responsibility, and now this private agony piled atop the public one, is one of the wonders of his story. He drew, perhaps, on the deep well of melancholy he had carried since boyhood, which had taught him to live alongside sorrow without being destroyed by it. He drew on his humor, and on a growing, brooding faith that some vast purpose was working itself out through all this suffering, beyond any man's power to see or shape. And he simply went on, day after weary day, doing the next thing that had to be done. As that second year of the war wore on, Lincoln's mind was turning, slowly and painfully, toward a step more momentous than any he had yet taken. A step that would change the whole meaning of the war. When the fighting began, he had been careful to say that its purpose was only to save the Union, not to touch slavery. He had feared to drive the wavering border states into the enemy's arms, and doubted his own lawful power to act. But as the terrible months passed, and the cost mounted, and victory stayed out of reach, he came to see that the Union and slavery could not both survive. For slavery, he saw at last, was the very heart and sinew of the rebellion, the thing the South was fighting for, the labor that fed its armies and worked its fields while its men marched off to war. To strike at slavery was to strike at the enemy's deepest strength. And there was more than strategy in it. Lincoln had hated slavery all his life, and now, in the fire of the war, he began to feel that its destruction might be the very purpose for which all this blood was being shed, that the nation might be being scourged for its great sin and remade through suffering into something truer to its own founding promise. And so, in the summer of 1862, he made his fateful decision. He would issue a proclamation declaring the slaves in the rebelling states to be free, an act of war, grounded in his power as commander-in-chief, that would turn the struggle for the Union into a struggle for freedom as well. He read his draft to his astonished cabinet, and then, at their wise counsel, he put it away in a drawer to wait. For to proclaim freedom in the midst of defeat would look like a cry of despair, an empty gesture from a losing side. He needed a victory first. And so he waited. The wait was long and agonizing, for the victory would not come. Through that summer, the war in the East went from bad to worse. The bold Southern commander, the great General Lee, drove the Union armies before him and then, in the autumn, carried the war northward, crossing into Maryland, threatening the very heart of the Union. It was one of the darkest hours of the whole conflict. And then, along a winding creek called Antietam, the two great armies met at last in the bloodiest single day the continent had ever seen, a day of such slaughter that the memory of it stunned the age. When that fearful day was over, Lee's advance had been checked, and his army fell back across the river into Virginia. It was not the crushing, decisive triumph Lincoln had prayed for. His cautious general let the beaten enemy escape unpursued, to Lincoln's deep frustration. But it was enough. The invasion had been turned back. The Union could call it a victory. And Lincoln, who had waited so long for even this, saw that his hour had come at last. He took the proclamation out of its drawer and made ready to change the character of the war and the course of the nation's history forever. He issued it first as a warning: unless the rebelling states laid down their arms and returned to the Union by the first day of the new year, he would declare their slaves forever free. The South, of course, did not return. It was fighting for the very thing he threatened, and would fight on to the bitter end. And so, as the old year died and the new one dawned, the appointed day arrived, the 1st of January, 1863, and Abraham Lincoln prepared to set his hand to the greatest act of his life. All that New Year's Day he stood in a receiving line, shaking hundreds of hands at the customary reception, until his own right hand was swollen and trembling with fatigue. Then at last he withdrew to his office, where the Emancipation Proclamation lay ready for his signature. He took up the pen and paused, not from any doubt, he said, for he had never in his life been more certain of doing right, but only from fear that his weary, shaking hand would make the signature look tremulous, and men would say he had hesitated. He waited until his hand was steady. And then, slowly and firmly, he signed. With that stroke of the pen, the war became a new thing. It was no longer only a war to restore the old Union as it had been, but a war to bring forth a new one, cleansed of its ancient wrong, a war for human freedom itself. The proclamation did not, in that instant, strike the chains from every slave. It reached only the states in rebellion, beyond the immediate power of Lincoln's government to enforce it. But its meaning was vast and unmistakable. Wherever the Union armies now advanced, they became armies of liberation, and freedom rolled forward with them across the South. And it opened the ranks of those armies to the freed men themselves. Black soldiers who had been barred from the fight now came forward in their tens of thousands to take up arms for the Union and for the freedom of their people, and they fought with a valor that silenced the doubters and moved the nation. Nearly 200,000 black men would serve before the war was done, and their courage on a dozen desperate fields helped turn the tide and redeem the promise. Lincoln came to see them as indispensable to the victory, and honored their sacrifice, and would not hear them slighted. Abroad, too, the proclamation worked a quiet magic. The great powers of Europe, and above all Britain, had watched the American war with cool and calculating eyes, and some had leaned toward recognizing the South. But once the struggle was plainly a war against slavery, no European government dared take the slaveholders' side against the sentiment of its own people, who hated slavery with a passion. The threat of foreign intervention, which had so haunted Lincoln, faded away. He had made the war a moral cause the whole world could read, and in doing so he had isolated the South and secured the Union's friends. For Lincoln himself, the proclamation marked a deep change, a kind of passage into the fullness of his purpose. The cautious politician who had once promised not to touch slavery had become the great emancipator, the man who would be forever bound up with the cause of human freedom. He never wavered in it afterward, never looked back, never entertained for a moment the thought of taking it back to buy an easier peace. "If my name ever goes into history," he said, "it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it." He had found, at the heart of the war's horror, the great meaning of his life. Yet the war itself ground on, as bloody and uncertain as ever. A great and costly victory here was followed by a shattering defeat there. The splendid Army of the Potomac, so often ill-led, suffered disaster after disaster in the East, even as the Union cause slowly gained in the West. The lists of the dead grew longer, the war weariness in the North grew heavier, and the voices calling for peace at any price, for letting the South go, for making terms with slavery, grew louder. Through it all, Lincoln held the course, absorbing the defeats, enduring the criticism, refusing to despair or to let go. He was assailed on every side, and by nearly everyone. The radicals thought him too slow and too soft. The conservatives thought him a reckless tyrant. The peacemen thought him a butcher prolonging a hopeless war. His own generals and cabinet members intrigued against him and thought him not up to his office. Few great leaders have been so abused in their own time. And he bore it mostly with a patient, melancholy good humor, keeping his eyes fixed on the two great objects that never changed, to save the Union and to make men free. All else he let flow past him like water. And slowly, beneath the surface of defeat and discouragement, the deep tide was turning the Union's way. The North's vast advantages, its greater numbers, its factories and railroads, its endless capacity to replace what the war destroyed, were beginning remorselessly to tell. The South was bleeding itself white in its victories, spending men it could not replace. Two great campaigns were now moving toward their climax, one in the East and one in the West, that would together break the back of the rebellion. The war was about to reach its terrible turning point in the summer of 1863. It came to its climax in the first days of July, around a quiet crossroads town in Pennsylvania called Gettysburg. General Lee, emboldened by his victories, had once more carried the war northward, deep into Union soil, hoping a great triumph there might break the North's will and win the South its independence at last. And there, by chance, the two mighty armies collided and locked together for 3 long days in the greatest battle ever fought upon the American continent. A battle whose fury and whose cost passed all that had come before. For 3 days the struggle raged across the fields and hills and stony ridges, back and forth, with a desperate courage on both sides that men would speak of in awe forever after. On the 3rd day the Southern Army flung itself in one final, magnificent, doomed assault against the center of the Union line. A great tide of men sweeping across open ground into the guns, and was broken and hurled back and could do no more. Lee's high tide had crested and fallen. On the 4th day, his army began the long, sad retreat southward, never again to threaten the North. The war's great turning had come. And in that very same week, far away down the Mississippi River, the Union won a second, quieter, and equally decisive victory. The great river fortress of Vicksburg, the last stronghold barring the Union's control of the mighty Mississippi, surrendered at last after a long siege to a determined, unassuming Western general named Ulysses Grant. With its fall, the whole length of the great river passed into Union hands, and the Confederacy was cut clean in two. In a single week at Gettysburg and at Vicksburg, the tide of the war had turned, and turned for good. Yet the victories, however great, were dearly bought, and the fields of Gettysburg were left strewn with a sorrow almost past bearing. Thousands upon thousands had fallen there in those 3 days, and the little town was overwhelmed by the scale of the loss. In the months that followed, a portion of the battlefield was set aside to be a cemetery, a final resting place for the Union dead, and a great ceremony was arranged to dedicate that hallowed ground. And among those invited to attend, and to add a few brief remarks, was the President of the United States. The main oration that day was given by a famous speaker, who held the vast crowd for 2 full hours with a grand and polished address in the high style of the age. Then Lincoln rose and drew from his pocket a single small sheet of paper and spoke for scarcely 2 minutes. A few short sentences, plain and quiet, over almost before the crowd had settled to listen. It was so brief that the photographer had scarcely readied his camera before the president sat down again. Many there thought little of it at the time, but those few plain sentences would outlive every grand oration of the age. For in that handful of words, Lincoln gave the whole war its meaning, and the whole nation its truest voice. He reached back 77 years to the founding promise that all men are created equal, and he cast the terrible war as the great testing of whether a nation so conceived could long endure. He said the world would little note nor long remember what was spoken there, and was wrong in that alone, for the world has never forgotten it. He asked the living to take from the honored dead an increased devotion to the cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. And he closed with a vow that has echoed down through all the years since, that these dead should not have died in vain, that the nation should, under God, have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people by the people for the people should not perish from the earth. In those few lines, the plain man from the frontier had distilled the whole meaning of democracy itself, and lifted the nation's bloody struggle into something timeless and universal. The Gettysburg Address is counted today among the greatest utterances ever spoken by any leader, in any age. It is worth marveling for a moment at how far he had come to speak those words. The boy who had scratched his letters on a wooden shovel by firelight, who had walked miles to borrow a book, who had less than a single year of formal schooling in his whole life, now giving his country a scripture of freedom in language so pure and so strong that it will be read as long as the nation lasts. All those long nights of self-teaching, all those borrowed volumes read to tatters, had gone into the making of that plain and perfect speech. The rail splitter had become the poet of the Republic. But there was little time to dwell on words, however great, for the war ground on, and the killing with it. The victories of that summer had turned the tide, but they had not ended the struggle. The South, though split and bleeding, fought on with a stubborn courage, and would fight on for nearly 2 years more. The North, weary beyond telling of the endless casualty lists, longed for the thing to be over. And Lincoln, more careworn than ever, bent his mind to the one question that now mattered above all others: how to bring the long agony, at last, to its end. The answer, he had come to believe, lay with the quiet general who had taken Vicksburg. In Ulysses Grant, Lincoln saw at last the thing he had sought so long and so vainly through the dark early years: a general who would fight. Grant was no dashing figure. He was a plain, silent, rumpled man, undramatic and unassuming, who had known failure himself before the war. But he understood, as Lincoln understood, the hard arithmetic of the thing, that the North's advantage lay in its greater strength, and that the way to victory was to grip the enemy and never let go. And so, in the spring of 1864, Lincoln did what he had waited 3 long years to do. He gave the whole of the Union armies into the hands of a single man he trusted, and made Grant the general-in-chief of all his forces. It was an act of faith and of judgment, and it proved the soundest of his war. At last he had a commander he need not prod or plead with, one who would take the vast power of the North and drive it, relentlessly and without pause, straight at the heart of the Confederacy, in a great coordinated pressure that the failing South could not withstand. Grant's plan was simple and terrible and right. There would be no more grand marches ending in retreat, no more single battles followed by months of idleness. He would grip Lee's army in Virginia and hold on, fighting day after day, battle after battle, absorbing fearful losses and inflicting them, never releasing his hold, wearing the smaller Southern army down by the sheer weight of numbers it could never match. It was a grim and costly kind of war, a war of attrition, and it would break the Confederacy in the end. But first it would fill the North with mourning as never before. For the cost of it, that spring and summer, was staggering beyond anything the war had yet seen. As Grant drove south toward the Confederate capital, the two armies grappled through a month of continuous, ferocious fighting, and the casualty lists that came north were longer and more terrible than ever, tens of thousands falling in a matter of weeks. The North reeled at the price. Grant was called a butcher. Lincoln was blamed for the endless slaughter. And yet the president, understanding what Grant was doing, stood by him unshaken and told the anxious people only that the general meant to fight it out on this line if it took all summer. That summer of 1864 was, for Lincoln, perhaps the lowest point of the entire war. The armies seemed stalled, for all their fearful losses. Grant was locked in a long, grinding siege before the Confederate defenses, and Lee would not break, and the promised victory did not come. The North sank into a deep gloom and a bitter war weariness. The casualty lists had numbed the nation, and everywhere men asked whether the terrible price could be worth the paying, and whether the war could ever truly be won at all. And in that summer of despair, Lincoln had to face the people in an election. It was a remarkable and little-noted thing that the nation held its regular election in the very midst of the greatest war it had ever known. Lincoln himself insisted upon it. A democracy that suspended its elections even in wartime, he believed, would have already lost the thing it was fighting for. And so, even as the armies bled in Virginia, the country prepared to vote on whether to keep him for another 4 years, or to turn him out, and with him, perhaps, the whole cause of union and freedom for which so much blood had been shed. His opponents were formidable, and his own chances looked grim. The party of the opposition nominated none other than his old cast-off general, McClellan, and adopted a platform declaring the war a failure and calling for peace. A peace that could only mean letting the South go free with slavery intact and the Union broken forever. Weary voters, sick of the killing, might well embrace it. So dark did things look that Lincoln himself, in the depth of that summer, privately concluded that he would probably be defeated, and quietly resolved to do his utmost to save the Union in the brief time left to him before he must hand over power. He wrote out, in that black hour, a remarkable private pledge and sealed it, and had his cabinet sign the back of it unread. In it he bound himself, should he lose the election, to work with all his power alongside the president-elect to save the Union before the coming inauguration, for after it, he feared, it might be too late. It was an act of deep and selfless patriotism, made in the expectation of his own defeat. He had, it seemed, made his peace with the loss of everything he had striven for, so long as the nation itself might yet be saved. And then, as so often in this story, The darkness broke at the very moment it seemed deepest. Word came flashing north from the deep south. The city of Atlanta, one of the last great strongholds of the Confederacy, had fallen to the Union armies under General Sherman. It was a tremendous, unmistakable victory, proof to all the world that the war was being won after all, that the sacrifices had not been in vain. The gloom of the North lifted almost overnight. The talk of a failed war and a negotiated peace withered away. And Lincoln's fortunes, so lately despaired of, were transformed in an instant. When the people went to the polls that November, they returned him to office in a great wave, and by a margin that left no doubt of the nation's will. Most striking of all were the votes of the soldiers themselves, the very men who were doing the fighting and the dying, who might have been thought most eager for peace at any price. They voted overwhelmingly for Lincoln, for the war, and for its completion, choosing to see the thing through to the end rather than let their comrades' sacrifice be wasted. It was a profound vindication, and it moved him deeply. He had been re-elected President of the United States, the first president in a generation to win a second term, and this time by the free and deliberate choice of a people in the midst of war, endorsing his course and steeling themselves to finish it. The mandate was clear: to press on to total victory, and to make an end, once and for all, of the great wrong that had caused it all. And so, strengthened by the people's verdict, Lincoln turned his mind to a final and lasting settlement of the question that had haunted the Republic from its birth: the abolition of slavery itself, forever, by the fundamental law of the land. For he knew that his Emancipation Proclamation, mighty as it was, might not be enough to last. It had been a war measure, grounded in his powers as commander-in-chief, and when the war ended, its legal force might be questioned, or narrowed, or undone. Nothing short of an amendment to the Constitution itself, the supreme and permanent law, could place freedom beyond the reach of any future court or Congress or change of heart. And so Lincoln threw the whole weight of his office and his prestige behind a 13th Amendment to abolish slavery throughout the whole United States, for all time. The struggle to pass it through the Congress was fierce and close, for such an amendment required not a mere majority but a great two-thirds vote, and the votes were not there to be easily had. Lincoln labored for it with all his political art, persuading, bargaining, cajoling, bending every effort to win over the last few doubtful members. He wanted it done, and done now, while the iron was hot and his power was at its height. And at last, in the early days of the new year, the great vote was taken in the House, amid an almost unbearable suspense. When the tally was announced, and the amendment had passed, the chamber erupted in a scene of wild and unprecedented joy, members weeping openly, embracing one another, cheering until they were hoarse, while the crowds in the galleries roared and wept with them. Outside, cannon thundered in salute across the Capitol. It was one of the great moments of the whole American story, the moment when the nation resolved, in its fundamental law, to wash its hands forever of human bondage. Lincoln, who had done so much to bring it to pass, called it a king's cure for all the evils of the age. The boy who had watched men sold in chains at the New Orleans wharves, and gone hard and silent at the sight, had lived to strike the shackles from an entire people by the highest law of his country. It was the great work of his life brought to its fulfillment, the answer at last to the wrong that had troubled him since youth. Slavery, the ancient contradiction at the heart of the Republic, the thing the founders had feared to name and failed to end, was now set upon the sure road to its final and total extinction. The nation was to have, as he had promised at Gettysburg, its new birth of freedom. And now, as the winter of 1865 gave way towards spring, the end of the long war itself was coming plainly into view. Sherman's army, having taken Atlanta, had marched clean across the deep South to the sea and then turned north, cutting a great swath through the very heartland of the Confederacy, breaking its will and its power as it went. Grant still held Lee gripped fast in Virginia, and the noose was tightening month by month. The South was exhausted, starving, its armies dwindling, its cause all but lost. After 4 years of unimaginable suffering, the terrible war was drawing, at last, toward its close. Lincoln felt the end approaching and turned his weary mind more and more toward the peace that must follow, toward the hardest question of all, which was how to bind up a nation that had torn itself so cruelly apart. He did not want vengeance. He had never wanted it. Even now, with victory in his grasp and his enemies at his mercy, his thoughts ran not to punishment but to reconciliation, to the healing of wounds, to the restoring of the broken family of the nation. How to win the peace and not merely the war, that was the great task he saw before him. And he prepared to meet it with the largeness of soul that was his alone. In the first days of March, with victory near and the war all but won, Lincoln stood once more upon the steps of the Capitol to be inaugurated for his second term. The building was finished now, its great dome complete at last, crowned with the bronze figure of freedom, the unfinished nation made whole in stone and iron, even as the Union itself was being made whole again by blood. A vast crowd stood waiting in the mud beneath a gray and clouded sky. And then, as Lincoln rose to speak, the clouds broke, and the sun came streaming through, and many took it for an omen of the peace to come. The speech he gave that day was short, and unlike any inaugural address before or since, less a statement of policy than a kind of sermon, a searching meditation on the meaning of the war and the mystery of God's purposes within it. He did not boast of the coming victory, nor heap blame upon the beaten South. Instead, he spoke with a deep and humble sorrow of the whole nation's guilt in the great offense of slavery, North and South alike, and bowed before the terrible justice by which the war had scourged the land for that shared and ancient sin. And then, at the very end, he rose to words of such mercy and grandeur that they are carved today upon his memorial in the Capitol, and remembered wherever his name is spoken. With malice toward none, he said, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, and to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan. It was the whole of his great heart, laid open at last. No hatred, no vengeance, only the will to heal. Those words set the note for the peace he meant to make, a peace without cruelty, a peace that would welcome the fallen South back into the family of the nation rather than grind it under. There would be no scaffolds, no mass punishments, no long revenge, if Lincoln had his way. "Let them up easy," he said of the defeated rebels. He longed only to see the guns fall silent, the Union restored, the wounds bound up, and the whole broken country set once more upon the path of peace and freedom together. It was a vision worthy of the man, and it very nearly came to pass. And now the long-awaited end came swiftly. In the first days of April, the Confederate lines before the southern capital of Richmond broke at last under Grant's relentless pressure, and the government of the Confederacy fled, and its soldiers set fire to the city as they abandoned it. After 4 terrible years, the capital of the rebellion had fallen. And in one of the most extraordinary moments of the whole story, Abraham Lincoln himself came quietly into the fallen city, walking its smoking streets on foot, almost unguarded, to see with his own eyes the end of the great struggle. What happened then he never forgot, nor did any who witnessed it. For as he walked through the ruined streets of Richmond, the freed slaves of the city recognized him, and word ran ahead of him like fire, and they came pouring out by the hundreds to see the man who had set them free. They crowded around him, weeping, reaching out to touch him, some falling to their knees before him, and he, deeply moved, bade them not to kneel to him, but to kneel only to God, and to thank him for the freedom they would henceforth enjoy. It was the fulfillment, in living flesh, of all his labor. A few days later, in a farmhouse parlor at a place called Appomattox Courthouse, the last act was played out. The great Southern general, Robert Lee, his army surrounded and starving and reduced to a shadow, met with Grant to surrender at last. And Grant, following the spirit of his president exactly, offered terms of extraordinary generosity. No humiliation, no imprisonment, only that the beaten men lay down their arms and go home in peace, and even keep their horses for the spring plowing. The war was over. The Union was saved. And it was to end, as Lincoln had wished, not in vengeance but in grace. When the news reached Washington, the city, and the whole North erupted in a joy such as had never been known. After 4 years of grief and dread and endless mourning, the war was won, the nightmare was over, the Union was whole again. Church bells pealed and cannon thundered and crowds surged singing through the streets, half delirious with relief and gladness. They gathered before the White House, calling for the president, and Lincoln came to the window and, in a characteristic touch, asked the band to strike up Dixie, the Song of the South, which he said was now, once again, a tune belonging to all the nation. He spoke to the rejoicing crowds not of triumph, but of the hard and delicate work of peace that lay ahead, of how to restore the Southern states, of how to knit the nation back together, of the rights and the future of the freed people, whom he was determined should not be abandoned. His mind was already reaching past the victory toward the reconstruction of the country, the great task of his second term, the binding up of the wounds. He was tired, more tired than he had ever been, worn to the bone by 4 years of unimaginable strain. But the end was in sight, and his heart, for once, was light. Those closest to him remarked upon the change in him in those few bright April days. A lifting of the great weight he had carried so long, a lightness and a gentleness they had not seen in years. The haggard care seemed to ease from his face. He spoke of the future, of the years of peace ahead, of at last taking his weary family home to Illinois when his work was done, of the quiet life he might one day return to. He had come through the valley. The terrible thing was finished. He had saved the Union and freed the slaves and won his people's love, and there was, it seemed, a little time now for happiness. On what would prove to be the last afternoon, he went for a long carriage ride with his wife, just the two of them, and he was cheerful and full of quiet plans. Mary remarked that she had scarcely ever seen him so happy, and he answered that he felt he had reason to be. The war was over, and with the coming of peace he trusted they might yet put their long sorrows behind them and find some contentment at last. They spoke of travels they might take, of the boys, of the years to come when the burden was finally laid down. It was the calm and the tenderness of a man who believed the storm had passed. He had, all his life, been a man haunted by dreams and forebodings, and in those last days a strange, quiet fatalism seemed to settle over him, a sense of some shadow near at hand. He had spoken more than once of a curious dream of a great grief in the house, and he did not seem afraid of it. He had done his work. Whatever came, he was ready. He held no bitterness and feared no man, and moved among the people who loved him with an open trust that he would not give up even when others warned him to take more care for his safety. And so we come to the evening of the 14th of April, a Good Friday, 5 days after the surrender, with the whole North still bright with the joy of peace. Weary as he was, the president had promised to go out that night to the theater, to see a light comedy and to give the tired city the sight of its leader sharing in the general gladness. He would rather have stayed home and rested, but the visit had been announced and the people expected him, and he would not disappoint them. And so, that evening, he and Mary drove to Ford's Theater to sit and laugh a little among their people on the night the war had truly ended. Here, out of tenderness for the hour, let us draw the curtain gently and not linger over what took place. Let it be enough to say that as the president sat in the flag-draped box above the stage, watching the play in the happy dark, a great evil came silently upon him out of the shadows. An assassin, a man consumed by hatred for all that Lincoln had done and stood for. In a single terrible instant, in the midst of the laughter, the shot was fired, and the tall, kindly man who had borne so much slumped quietly in his chair, and the theater's joy turned in a heartbeat to horror and to screaming. They carried him, senseless and dying, across the street to a small back bedroom in a boarding house, and there they laid his long frame diagonally across a bed too short to hold it, and there through the long night the doctors and the cabinet and the weeping members of his circle kept their helpless watch. He never woke. Through the dark hours his breathing slowly failed, while outside a stunned city began to learn the unthinkable news, and a cold rain fell. And in the gray first light of the morning, quietly, the great heart ceased at last, and Abraham Lincoln was gone. In the silence that followed, One of the men gathered at the bedside spoke a few words over the still form, and they have never been forgotten. Now, he said, he belongs to the ages. And so he did. The poor boy from the frontier cabin, the rail splitter, the failed storekeeper, the country lawyer, the sorrowing wartime president who had saved his nation and freed a people, had passed out of the reach of all his enemies and all his cares into the keeping of history and of the ages that would honor him without end. He had given, as he said the fallen soldiers had given, the last full measure of devotion. The grief that swept the nation at the news was like nothing the country had ever known, vast and deep and universal. The very joy of the victory made the blow more cruel. A people who had been dancing in the streets one day were plunged into mourning the next. Strong men wept openly. Whole cities draped themselves in black. The freed people of the South, above all, wept for the man who had broken their chains, mourning him as a father. It was as though the whole nation, North and South, black and white, had lost someone of its own, as indeed it had. They bore his body home to Illinois by a long and mournful journey, the funeral train winding slowly across the country by nearly the same route that had carried him, living and hopeful, to Washington 4 years before. For 2 weeks it traveled, through city after city, and everywhere the people came out to grieve. They stood in silent throngs along the tracks in the darkness, lighting bonfires, baring their heads as the train passed. Millions filed past his coffin in the great cities to look a last time upon his face. Never had a people so mourned a leader, nor followed one so far to his rest. At last they brought him home to Springfield, to the prairie town he had left with such foreboding, and laid him to rest in the quiet earth of Illinois, not far from the circuit he had ridden as a young lawyer, in the country that had made him. The long journey was over. The rail splitter had come home. And there he lies still, beneath a tall monument on a green hill, while the nation he saved goes on, generation after generation, coming to stand in silence at his tomb, and to remember and to give thanks. He left behind him a nation transformed, remade by the 4 terrible years of his presidency into something it had never quite been before. The Union was saved, and the old question of whether it could be broken at will was answered forever. It was one nation now, indissoluble, and would remain so. And slavery, the ancient wrong that had shadowed the Republic from its birth, was gone, abolished root and branch by the great amendment he had fought to pass, never to return. The country he handed on had been purged, through fire and blood, of its deepest contradiction. He had done more than save a country and free a people, though either alone would have been enough to make him great. He had redefined, for his own nation and for the watching world, the very meaning of what that nation was for. In his plain and lasting words at Gettysburg at his second inaugural in 100 letters and speeches, he had fixed the idea that America was not merely a place or a government, but a proposition, that all men are created equal, and that a government of the people, by the people, and for the people was a thing worth any sacrifice to preserve. And he had shown, in his own person, what such a nation might make possible. His whole life was the living proof of his own creed. that a poor boy born in a dirt-floored cabin, with no wealth and no name and almost no schooling, might by his own labor and character rise as high as any man on earth and do as much good. He was democracy's own son, raised up from the bottom of society to its very summit, owing his greatness to nothing but himself and the free country that let him climb. In him, the American promise was not a phrase but a fact. Those who knew him best remembered, in the end, not the great deeds but the man himself, his kindness, his patience, his sorrow, his endless humor, his boundless charity toward even his enemies. He had wielded more power than any American before him and had never once been corrupted or hardened by it. He had suffered more abuse than almost any leader and had answered it with forbearance. He had every excuse for bitterness and chose instead to bear no malice toward any living soul. It is this, perhaps, as much as anything he achieved, that has kept his memory so warm across the years. Today his tall, gaunt, kindly figure has passed almost into legend, carved into mountains and into marble, printed on the money that passes through 1,000,000 hands each day. His name given to towns and schools and children beyond counting. The great memorial in the Capitol, where his words are graven in the stone and his brooding likeness gazes out over the city he saved, has become a place of pilgrimage for all who cherish freedom, a temple to the plainest and greatest of Americans. He belongs, as they said that gray morning, to the ages now, and the ages have kept him. And yet, for all the marble and the legend, it is good to remember him as he really was. Not a distant monument, but a living man, tall and stooped and homely, with mud on his boots and a joke on his lips and a deep sadness in his eyes. A man who split rails and told stories and grieved for his lost boys and could not bear to see a soldier shot for falling asleep. He was one of us, raised out of the common clay, and that is the wonder of him. The greatness was real, but so was the plainness, and the two were never truly separate. So let his long story rest here at its close, as you yourself are surely resting now. From a cold cabin in the Kentucky woods to a tomb on an Illinois hill, it was a journey longer and stranger than any fable. A poor boy who taught himself by firelight and grew into the man who held a breaking nation in his 2 hands and would not let it fall. He carried a burden heavier than any of his countrymen, through the darkest years they ever knew, and he carried it with wisdom and mercy and an unbreakable good heart. And when it was done, he laid it down and belonged to the ages. There is a kind of comfort in a life like his to carry with you down into sleep. It is the comfort of knowing that out of the hardest beginnings, great things may still grow, that patience and honesty and a steadfast heart may in the end outlast all the cleverness and cruelty of the world, that even in the darkest of times, a single plain and decent soul may hold fast and make a difference and light the way for those who come after. He believed to the last in the better angels of our nature. And across all the years, his faith still gently reassures us. So let your thoughts grow soft and slow now, and let the long story fade like a lamp dimming in a quiet room. There is nothing more you need to hold on to tonight. No names, no dates, no battles. Let them all drift away into the dark and keep only the quiet feeling of the thing. You are warm and you are safe and the night is long, and there is all the time in the world to rest. Let your breath come slow and deep. Let the last of the day's cares loosen and fall away. The story is told, and the fire is low, and sleep is very near. Thank you for spending this quiet while with me, and with the memory of Abraham Lincoln. If these gentle histories bring you peace, there will be another waiting for you tomorrow night, and the night after that, whenever you have need of a soft voice in the dark. But do not trouble yourself with any of that now. Now there is only rest. Sleep well wherever in the world you are and whatever hour it is where you lie. The lamp is going out. The night has come. And the long, kind story of that good man will keep safe and sound until we meet again. Good night.